address of the evening from Professor Colin Shindler, an esteemed academic from the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London, and emeritus professor of associated with the Association of Israel Studies. Colin Shindler.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for waiting. In London, there's been many different events regarding the Balfour Declaration. Many different communities have celebrated it and not commemorated it. Celebrated it and not apologised for it. So I think it's wonderful, particularly on your heading here, you talk about celebrating. I think that's very important. I keep bumping into ex-Dubliners in London, if there is such a thing as ex, who keep, when I tell them I was going to Ireland, to Dublin, they say, "Oh, it's marvellous, and please give them my regards." I was actually at the dinner last Thursday, and I bumped into Buji Herzog, Isaac Herzog, and I mentioned it to him as well. He said, "Oh, definitely, please give my best regards." And of course, Herzog's grandfather was Chief Rabbi of Ireland, and his father was President of Israel. And I remember Chaim Herzog speaking in Gaelic to a motionless, stunned Irish Parliament, and I thought it was the most marvellous occasion. Finally, I'd like to just say thank you to the Jewish Historical Society of Ireland for inviting me and for arranging this, which, as I've said, it's important to commemorate and to celebrate the Balfour Declaration. I'd like to particularly thank Yankee, because there's a personal connection. His parents, my wife's parents, were neighbours in wartime Letchworth. They'd been evacuated from London and formed part of a community there. So these two branches of the family have known each other for 70 years, if not more. And you mentioned your father, Ellie, who I knew, and I'm sure Ellie and my wife's parents are looking down now, and your mother, who's well into her 90s from Jerusalem, are identifying with what's going on here today. It's an important occasion. So, Zionism. Zionism is a national liberation movement of the Jewish people. It arose out of European nationalism in the aftermath of the French Revolution. The influences on Zionism, on why Jewish nationalism arose, and don't forget the Balfour Declaration recognized implicitly that the Jews were a nation, not simply a religious group, but a nation in exile. And we are often told that the Jews survived 2 millennia because of Judaism, because it was a portable homeland. Yes, that's true, but they also survived because of an innate national identity, which survived throughout all that time. And they were influenced by Polish nationalism, by the Risorgimento of Italian nationalism, and indeed by Irish republicanism. One of my interests, interests is the Israeli right, and Irish Republican literature certainly influenced the Zionist right. I came across many years ago, you've heard of the Stern Gang as is referred to by the British authorities. Abraham Stern would write articles, and he quoted a long piece in Hebrew, which I managed to trace back, and it was the Victory of Sinn Féin by P.S.O. Hegarty from 1924. So the Irish national movement also highly influenced the Jewish month, particularly in the interwar years, because the Zionists saw the Irish struggle as their template. It was the nearest in time, and it was the same enemy. So, the Jews became aware in the 19th century, certainly, that they were a nation, influenced by many of the other European national movements. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II, the Tsar Liberator, meaning the person who liberated the serfs in Russia, was assassinated in St. Petersburg. This led to the infamous May Laws the year later in 1882. And the Jews were blamed. There were a lot of anti-Semitic tendencies within the May Laws, and between 1881 and 1884 there was a whole raft of pogroms. And this awakened a lot of Jews in Russia, particularly those Jews who had formerly left the Jewish community and become revolutionaries, joining groups like the Narodnaya Volya. These people became aware that they were Jews once again when the revolutionaries did not condemn the pogromists, because they needed to go to the people to influence the people. And therefore, if the Jews were being butchered, it was a secondary matter. And the revolutionary Jews understood that this was not right. And therefore, the revolutionary Jews became Jews again, but not the sort of Jews that they were before. They became national Jews. They became Zionists. In 1882, the first Aliyah, a small group of students from Kharkov in the Ukraine, went to Palestine, the Biluim. In 1883, I'd like to read a quote to you here, from Moses Lilienblum, who was one of these young men who perhaps characterized what the Jews of that first period thought. He said this. He wrote it in an article in 1883 called The Future of Our People. And Lilienblum said this: "The opponents of nationalism see us as uncompromising nationalists, with a nationalist God and a nationalist Torah. Nationalists see us as cosmopolitans, whose homeland is wherever we happen to be well off. Religious Gentiles say that we are devoid of any faith, and the free thinkers among them say that we are orthodox and believe in all kinds of nonsense. The liberals say we are conservatives, and the conservatives call us liberal. Some bureaucrats and writers see us as the root of anarchy, insurrection, and revolt. And the anarchists say we are capitalists, the bearer of the biblical civilization, which is in their view based on slavery and parasitism." Jews felt unwanted. The Jews felt alienated. The Jews understood that they were on the margins of history. And it was this sense that gave rise to a Jewish nationalism, to Zionism. Now, perhaps it's wrong to say specifically that the solution to the Jewish problem was solely Zionism. There are many solutions, some which were non-territorial. But a book that was published about 25 years ago was called The Jewish States, States for the Jews, Uganda, Azerbaijan, and 34 other plans. Uganda, as has been mentioned, was suggested by the Zionists in 1903, and even Herzl supported it. Azerbaijan was put forward by the Soviets. It's on the border of Russia, border of China. It was the Jewish autonomous region. The Zionists looked to the Mormons. Utah was a good idea. There are plans in places like Angola, in Kimberley, Australia, and many others. But at the end of the day, they came back to the idea that a Jewish territorial unit had to be based in the ancient, historic Jewish homeland of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. There were different types of Zionism. Dov Ber Borochov was a Marxist Zionist. Herzl was a general Zionist when everyone was a general Zionist. There were no factions in 1897. In 1898 there was already a socialist faction. And even Weizmann put forward a democratic faction, which was opposed to the rabbis. Moses Hess was one of the originators of socialist Zionism. And interestingly enough, shortly after the establishment of the State of Israel, his books were published not only in Israel, but in East Germany, because he was a Marxist. Aber Achimeir, during the interwar years, thought that Benito Mussolini's views were okay. This, I might add, was before Italy became anti-Semitic. The anti-Semitic laws were only promulgated in 1938. Achimeir was very keen on Mussolini. And then, of course, you have religious Zionism. Zvi Hirsch Kalischer in the 19th century was a progenitor of religious Zionism, proto-Zionist. And he was influenced by the Italian nationalists. On the other side of the coin, there were the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, who believed that you should not force God's hand. They looked to the Hacham Sofer, who was a great religious leader in Hungary in the 19th century. And he put forward 3 oaths. The basis of this is that you should not intervene. There should be no human intervention in the coming of the Messiah or the return to the land of Israel. And indeed, Reform Judaism as well was highly assimilationist and acculturated. And they opposed Zionism. And indeed, it's often said, in 1897, we talk about Herzl and the first Zionist Congress being held in Basel. In fact, it was due to be held in Munich, but the Jews who were frightened of this national characteristic opposed it, and it had to be moved to Basel. And in fact, it's not called the Jewish state, the Judenstaat. If it was the Jewish state, it would be the Jüdische Staat. In fact, it's the state of the Jews. And Ahad Ha'am, one of the great spiritual leaders of Zionism, said that a Jewish state should be, the state of the Jews should be a Jewish state, unlike other states. So we have all this taking place at this particular point in time. And this is the background, if you like, to the development of the Balfour Declaration. Theodor Herzl was someone who came from an assimilated, acculturated background, who began to confront the anti-Semitism of Vienna in the late 19th century. In fact, one of his earliest views to solve the Jewish problem was mass conversion. He was going to lead the Jews to St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. He gradually began to become aware of the distinct anti-Semitic feeling that was taking place in Habsburg Empire in Vienna at that time. In the first part of this century, British politicians began to become aware of the Zionist movement. Herzl was a wonderful spin doctor. You can see photographs of the delegates to the first Zionist Congress dressed in their dinner jackets. these were often people from the backwoods of Tsarist Russia, but it looked good to dress them up, to project them. And early British politicians began to take some sort of note. Lloyd George, particularly, was very sympathetic. As has been said, he came from Wales, he came from a religious background. He knew more about the Bible, he said, than his own homeland, biblical land of Israel. But one thing I would stress, despite the sympathy, despite the spiritual relationship, the first priority of British politicians were British interests, British national interests, before anything else. The Marquess of Reading, Lord Reading, spoke of Lloyd George and Zionism, saying that Lloyd George had a poetic vision of Zionism. And that's true. That's absolutely true. War broke out between Britain and Germany in August 1914. November 1914, Turkey entered the war on the side of Germany and the Austro-Hungarians. Within a few days of the outbreak of war, Herbert Samuel was the first Jew to sit in a British cabinet, was talking about the possibilities of a Jewish homeland. And what was remarkable, he'd never shown any interest in this before. He mentioned it to Lord Grey, who was the Foreign Secretary. So all of this suddenly happens, literally within days of Turkey entering the war. Why? Because Turkey was the sick man of Europe, and the Ottoman Empire would be dissected. So on the 3rd of December 1914, we already had Chaim Weizmann meeting Lloyd George. In January 1915, Herbert Samuel puts forward a memorandum to the cabinet about Zionism. He doesn't talk about a Jewish state tomorrow morning, but in 100 years hence. And they basically don't take any notice. He issues a shorter second memorandum in March 1914. But what is interesting is this. The Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, was adamantly opposed to this. How do we know this? Well, Asquith, who was then in his 60s, was having an affair with Venetia Stanley, who was in her late 20s. He used to write to her 3 times a day. These notes were not for public scrutiny, quite obviously. They were not the politician's public speech. It was not in Hansard. And he says this, if I can find this. Sorry, could I have it here? Yes. This is his letter to Venetia on the 13th of March, 1917, probably after the second memorandum that Herbert Samuel submitted to the cabinet. And he says this: I think I told you, he wrote to Venetia Stanley, that Herbert Samuel has written an almost dithyrambic memorandum urging that in the carving up of the Turks' Asiatic dominions, we should take Palestine, into which the scattered Jews could in time swarm back from all the quarters of the globe, and in due course obtain home rule. What an attractive community. Curiously enough, the only other partisan is Lloyd George. I need not say, does not care a damn for the Jews, or their places, or future, and thinks that it will be an outrage to let the Christian holy places, Bethlehem, Mount of Olives, Jerusalem, etc., pass into the possession or under the protection of agnostic, atheistic France. So, he's saying, even at that early stage, that Lloyd George's raison d'etre for supporting Zionism, in one sense, is to oppose a French presence there. So, why was Lloyd George so interested in Zionism? Two reasons I can give. A colleague of mine, Michael Cohen, Bar-Ilan University in Israel, has pointed out that in February 1915, this is just a few weeks after the entry of Turkey into the war, that a group of Turkish soldiers, led by a couple of Germans, were able to cross the Sinai Desert. This was regarded previously by the British as a buffer, that the Turks could not come down from Palestine, come through the desert, and attack the British in Egypt. The desert was a buffer, was a barrier. Now, within a few weeks of the war starting, the Turks were able to do this. The British thought, well, therefore, Palestine is important to us. It's a strategic asset. They needed to have that in order, I think someone else had said, as a passageway to India. So that also happened. Lloyd George was also opposed to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes-Picot Agreement between Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot was negotiated over almost a year, and basically divided up the Middle East between the French and the British, and the Russians had a hand in there somewhere. A lot of it was vague. But Lloyd George vehemently opposed this because of the French possibility of having a presence in the Middle East. So, 1916 was therefore an important year for the Zionists. In the middle of the year, I think it was in June, Lord Kitchener, who had opposed having anything to do with the Jews, an Eastern Front, the Zionists, went down in HMS Hampshire off the Orkneys, sunk by a German U-boat. To put it bluntly, he was removed from the political equation. Lloyd George stepped in. At the end of the year, beginning of December 1916, there was essentially a coup against Asquith, and Lloyd George becomes Prime Minister. Beginning of December 1916. And it's from this point that we see the beginnings of a movement to grant a declaration. The point about the Balfour Declaration is that it was a British initiative, not a Jewish one. The Jews, of course, wanted to have some sort of international charter of approval. But the initiative came from the British because it was in the interest of the British at that point in time to have the Zionists on board. Beginning of 1917, as other people have pointed out, the British forces were in a powerless position. The war was not being won, particularly in the Middle East. So, on the 28th of January, this is what, 6 weeks after Lloyd George obtained his power? Mark Sykes, who is one of the authors of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, meets Klein Weitzman. Nothing is said about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. While all this coupling up to the Zionists takes place, Sykes doesn't say a word, not a dicky bird, about the British plans to divide up the Middle East through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. A few days later, on the 7th of February, Mark Sykes meets the Zionist leadership. He meets Chaim Weizmann, Nachum Sokolov, Lord Rothschild, second Lord Rothschild, James de Rothschild. He meets Joseph Cowan, English Zionists, Harry Sacker, Norman Bentwich, etc. And Sykes, of course, intimates to them that he's very critical of the French, and he drops two things into their laps. One, wouldn't it be a good idea if there was some sort of letter, if there was some sort of declaration? And second of all, in parallel with this, wouldn't it be a good idea if there was some sort of military force that the Jews could form to fight with the Allies?
5 years.
Okay. And the day after, Nachum Sokolov is sent off to visit the French Prime Minister, to visit the Italian Prime Minister, to visit the Pope. His path lubricated by the British Foreign Office, by Mark Sykes. On the 3rd of April, Chaim Weizmann meets Lloyd George for breakfast. And again, Lloyd George mentions the idea, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a military force? There are something like 30 to 35,000 Russian Jews in England, mainly in the East End of London. And Lloyd George wanted to utilise them. The Russian Jews refused to fight on the Russian side, on the Eastern Front for the Tsar. They hated the Tsar. They hated the anti-Semitism of the Tsarist Empire. But they were willing to form a Jewish legion to go and fight in Palestine. Interestingly enough, Netanyahu made a speech last Thursday at the dinner. And the first part of it, he referred to the Jewish Legion and Balfour Declaration. And he referred to it in personal terms, because his father had named his elder brother, the elder brother Yonatan, who was killed at the raid in Entebbe in 1976, he had named it after John Patterson, who was the leader of the Zion New Corps and indeed of the Jewish Legion. He referred to him as British, whereupon I immediately said no, he was an Irish Protestant. And the rest of his speech was a typical politician's speech. So let me conclude about additional reasons for the Balfour Declaration. The right-wing conservatives, right-wing Tories, were vehemently opposed to Zionism. And there was a sort of almost a primal reaction to this from the liberals. The British wanted to keep the Russians in the war. In February 1917, the first Russian Revolution took place at Kerensky. And there was great demands, which of course led to the October Revolution of the Bolsheviks, that Russia should leave the war. They thought that the Russian Jews could somehow keep Russia in the war. They also believed that American Jews, through the Balfour Declaration, could bring America into the war. America came in April 1917. One of the problems was that many American Jews were pro-German because they'd come from Germany. There was not any, it wasn't Hitler's time, it wasn't the time of the Nazis. And so these were underlying motivations. It was believed at that time, particularly by many upper-class British politicians, that the Jews were somehow an international major power. They were all-powerful world Jewry. This applied to people like Balfour himself, to Rudyard Kipling, to the blessed Lloyd George. Let me just mention something here, if I can find it. Yes, here we are. In 1912, there was something called the Marconi Affair, whereby Herbert Samuel, as the Postmaster General, had given the contract to the Marconi Company to set up, I think, either to lay cable under the Atlantic Ocean or to set up a series of radio wireless. So it was the early days of radio. A lot of money could be made out of this. There was something of some form of insider trading, and various politicians made a killing, including people were fingered, including Lord Reading, including Lloyd George himself. And Lloyd George was very angry about this, and in a private letter to a friend in 1914, he characterised Samuel as a greedy, ambitious and grasping Jew with all the worst characteristics of his race. So what I'm saying is, there is this latent anti-Semitism which coexists with a profound pro-Zionism. So, the other thing to conclude, the Balfour Declaration is discussed many times, as other speakers have said. There are different versions of everyone, chips in and makes a contribution. Amory, a lot. Balfour Declaration is issued, but at the beginning of the last discussion, where it finally is agreed upon, Balfour makes the point that the Germans are already preparing their Balfour Declaration. They only get the international, all-powerful Jews on side, even though their ally was Turkey. And it's interesting to note that the prime opponent of the Balfour Declaration, Lord Curzon, who eventually succeeds Balfour, who is vehemently anti-Zionist, he votes for the Balfour Declaration because he believes that it's in Britain's interest to do so, to keep the Germans from issuing one. The interwar years are seen as ones of Britain trying to, on the one hand, trying to row back from the Balfour Declaration, on the other hand, enabling hundreds of thousands of Jews to emigrate to Palestine. These two things coexist in one and the same time. But to underline the point about the relationship between British interests and the Balfour Declaration, in 1939, as the war clouds in Europe are gathering, as Jews are trying to leave Europe for any place that will give them refuge and sanctuary, the white paper is issued by the British government, the Malcolm MacDonald white paper, and it says that Jews can enter Palestine for the next 5 years at the rate of 15,000 a year, making 75,000 in all. And after that, it will be up to the Arab majority. That was the final nail in the coffin of the Balfour Declaration and British fidelity to that. So, I can't offer you, how shall I put it? I try and offer you the reality as I believe it existed. But let me finish on this note. 100 years ago, the Zionists of 1917 saw people like Harry Sacker, Herbert Bentwich, Leon Simon, the eccentric second Lord Rothschild, to whom the Balfour Declaration was addressed, and their foreign-born colleagues, Chaim Weizmann, Vladimir Jabotinsky, Nachum Sokolov, They saw an opportunity, a window of opportunity. Window of opportunity was actually very short-lived, and they acted. And if it hadn't been for them, if it hadn't been for them reading the situation correctly, there would be no Hebrew Republic today in the land of Israel. And for their foresight, we should all be extremely grateful. Thank you.